Hello, everyone. It could be good morning, good afternoon. This is going to be the most awesome conversation. So I'm super excited. We'll dive right in. First of all, obviously, I'm Ashley Koff, registered dietitian here, hosting the Better Nutrition Expert interviews. And if you haven't joined us before, feel free to ask questions at any point. I will choose when I actually ask them of the guests because I want to make sure that we keep a good flow and get everyone's questions answered. But also, we're here to really learn from her knowledge too. So I want to have a good balance. If you're watching later at a different time, then I also just want to remind you, whether you grabbed this from YouTube or Facebook or clicked on a link somewhere, if you have questions, go ahead and ask those questions. Hi, Candace. Great to see you. It will tag us, and then I will make sure that I invite Kristin to answer any of the questions, certainly that you have for her. So without further ado, and remember, guys, if you see me looking down, I always just like to remind you this. It's not that I'm ignoring her or texting or checking in on basketball scores. Actually, that could be the case. In Kristin's case, we'd probably both be doing it. But yeah, exactly. But I'm actually just sharing this and making sure that our communities everywhere, that I get everybody's questions. So that's all that I'm going to be doing, handling. It reminds me to grab my phone. Okay. So this is one of my favorites because not just an incredible expert in the field of nutrition, but also a dear friend of mine. I'm so excited to have Kristin here because, one of the things that we try to do at the Better Nutrition Program is bring practitioners and patients together when we have shared information, when we actually use the same words, so we have shared lexicon. When we're able to talk about things, then we find that we get better results. But even more importantly, when you're talking to an expert, so I just really want to emphasize the expert in Better Nutrition expert interviews. When we're talking to an expert, it's somebody who understands and evaluates the science, but also has experience putting it into practice. So what you're going to get today from Kristin, I can already tell you, is not just, hey, this is a great idea or this is a trend. It's really going to be what the science says, but also what she's learned from implementing this and testing certain things out and talking about it. So without further ado, welcome, my dear. It is great to see you. Why don't we start off with, if you could, just give us a second of kind of how you stumbled upon the notion of fasting, which is our topic for today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you. I just want to say thank you, Ashley, to you as well. Your program is amazing. For anyone watching, they already know that. And it is such an honor and a privilege for me to be part of it today. So I stumbled upon it because I had led nutrition at the Cleveland Clinic Wellness Institute for almost a decade. And during that time, I realized that plan after plan after plan that I was implementing to my patients, they were just not able to do. They were failing at it for one reason or another. A lot of times I say to people, gosh, losing weight, and that's the bulk of my patients are people that want to lose weight. Some want it to prevent chronic conditions, live longer, etc. But losing weight is so much more than what you're putting into your mouth. It's all these other factors that we completely underestimate. So I just saw this over and over again, this trend. But when I realized that people were more successful with fasting and were able to keep it up and really look at it not as, okay, this is a diet I'm on until I lose 20 pounds and get into my bikini. They're looking at it more as this is what I'm doing for the rest of my life, because it's not a diet. It's a way that we should really structure our eating plan. That's how I stumbled upon it, because I really couldn't ignore the success that I was seeing in my patients in being able to do this.
Great. So let's, I think that's so important so often, as practitioners, we really learn so much from our patients. And I think what you said there, I love, we're going to really dive into this, is like it's diets that fail. It's not the person that fails. And so what we're trying to do here is help people be more successful, and fasting is one of those opportunities. So I wrote down a couple of things. I was reading some of that. You've written a ton. And so I just want to remind everyone, this is like a tease and a taste. You're going to learn a lot today, but there's so much more information at KristinKirkpatrick.com. And also, she has an awesome newsletter. So definitely sign up for that newsletter. I want to go through the lexicon. So I thought I would start with, if you could, sort of define fasting. And we'll get into later the different types of fasting, but define fasting and how is it different than, say, a diet, a cleanse, a detox, a reset. And so if we could start there, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. So fasting is really quite a simple explanation and definition. It is literally the absence of food for a certain period of time. When we get into the fasting types, we're going to see that that amount of time really varies based on the fasting mechanism. So that's the first thing. How is it different from cleansing and detoxing and things like that? Well, as you know, Ashley, as my friend and someone who you and I follow one another, you know I cannot stand the word detoxing a lot of times because the liver does most of our detoxing for us. So what we know in the difference here is that when you're detoxing, a lot of times you're relying on outside products or outside mechanisms that aren't long-term. They're short-term things. It's like a 5-day celery drink or these pills that you're going to take for a while or something like that. So it typically tends to be something that in your head, you're thinking, I'm going to do this for 30 days, right? The 30-day fast always pops into my mind. And I'm always like, what happens on like day one of the next month, right?
Right.
There's 30 days will end, right? So it's very different from that because of the fact that this really looks at not actually putting something in to detox, because a lot of times that's what we do. But it's actually taking the absence and looking at calorie restriction and looking at the efficiency of our cells that occur because of the fact that we have restricted actual food from our cells. So obviously that's different from like a sugar detox where you're going to give up sugar. But again, if we go into that word detoxing, and I have plenty of patients that have done sugar detoxing, a lot of times they just get back to eating sugar after 30 days because the cravings are so strong. So again, like fasting helps with taking away those cravings and things like that. So I wouldn't even put the two in the same ballpark in terms of how the average consumer relates to it. But in terms of actually like looking at the longevity impacts, the reduction in chronic disease, things like that, if you're wrapping your head around detox in that manner, it does achieve that without kind of the gimmicky side effects that detoxes a lot of times will give us.
Yeah, I love that. I love the whole notion of actually using a fast, which we're going to talk about. We're going to go through actually how to fast better, but using a fast as an opportunity for when you actually are eating the foods, eating those foods that helps the body's own detoxification system, and then having the fasting, which is this other piece. So I think that's so interesting. And I just a reminder too, I don't think I shared it in the introduction. If you guys don't know this about Kristin, she's the author of a book called Skinny Liver. So when we talk about detox or what the liver actually needs, and also why we're dealing with this whole epidemic of people where we've got fatty liver and issues that are keeping the body from, better metabolism, better skin, etc. Shout out for the book Skinny Liver, which also you can find out more about that at KristinKirkpatrick.com. Okay, so I want to go into it. So actually, I'm jumping out of a conference, so thank you for having me be able to be home at the Integrative Healthcare Symposium, where today one of the proponents and founders, I think, of a fasting program is speaking and talking to doctors, dietitians, practitioners, chiropractors, etc., about these benefits. And the main reason is, I believe, while we know that weight loss is like this thing that everybody wants, and we know that there's healthy weight loss where you lose fat mass, you retain lean body mass, but there are so many different ways we can do weight loss. I think what's really impressive and exciting about fasting is its capability, as you said, to help the body regenerate and really tackle some of these chronic diseases and some of these chronic symptoms and challenges, whether it's pain and some of the other stuff. So I thought what we would do is jump into fasting. There are different types of fasting, and I think that people are very confused when they're hearing intermittent fasting. I had somebody say to me, well, what's it like, or is it like what Jewish people do? I was like, yes, on Yom Kippur. So we talked about that part. And then somebody else said to me, I want to fast, but I can't give up my coffee. So don't worry, we're going to get into the specifics of that part too. But let's start with part one, which is there are many different types of fast. And so what is fasting, and what would you deem as what we would call better fasting?
Well, actually, it really depends on the patient. I have high-level executives that will want to do intermittent fasting, which I'll describe, that looks like a 5-2 approach because of the fact that they have a lot of social engagements in the evening, things like that. They might have to eat later in the evening. Then I have people, especially moms that I work a lot with, that are really interested in doing time-restricted eating, because time-restricted eating doesn't involve calorie restriction. It just involves shortening the time frame in which actually eating throughout the day. So number one, I tell dietitians this, I tell people that are interested, my patients, you really have to delve into what the patient's lifestyle looks like, because they are so different, and most of them, I mean, all of them will have some wonderful benefits, but the timing of when you're going to do it and whether or not you're going to encompass calorie restriction is really what the difference is between the 3 or 4 that are most commonly known by people.
Great. So let's go through that. You mentioned 5-2. I've heard other splits in terms of numbers. And then also with with intermittent fasting, the calorie amount, and also a question of the time of day. These are things that have come up, which is, is there a time frame that's better? So we can start to dive now into, we're in that, how are you doing the fasting better on that part?
Absolutely. So the first one, we can start with what I would call the most popular ones, is intermittent fasting, the 5-2 approach. And the 5-2 approach relates to 2 days where you are fasting and 5 days where you're not fasting, where you're just eating healthy. Now, that's a really important distinction. I remember, actually, I was watching a talk show last year, and this woman had come on talking about how she did a 5-2 approach. She lost like 50 pounds. And she said, well, the great thing was on my off days, I could eat pizza, I could eat ice cream, I could eat all these things. Like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
We always want to keep in mind that during fasting, if we are going to be eating on the times we're eating, we're still keeping a great whole foods diet, in eating real food and not indulging in those things. But if you are a woman and you are going to do a 5-2 plan and you're going to do 2 days, the days should not be consecutive, number one. And number two, you're going to have about 500 calories on each of those days. And that will be split by about a 200-calorie breakfast and a 300-calorie dinner. That's it. That's all you get. So while sometimes I think people are even confused when I talk about it, because I am such a non-believer in calorie counting. I know you are as well. There's plenty of studies that show it doesn't work. And then people will come back and say, well, I have to count my calories. I can only have 500 calories, right? But keep in mind, this is only 2 days out of the week that you're actually doing this. So that is a form of intermittent fasting, the 5-2 approach. If you're a man, you're going to have 600 calories. Sorry, ladies. Guys always get like extra of everything. They have more muscle. It stinks, but...
now, what if it's interesting that we said they shouldn't be consecutive days. Does it matter how many days are between them? Is there an optimal, like 1 day fasting, 2 days, or is that sort of lifestyle dependent?
It's really lifestyle dependent. So what I tell my patients is, like, look at your week and figure out what are the 2 days that you can do this.
Okay.
Right? It's obviously not going to be the day that you're going to go out with the girls and like watch a movie and maybe get dinner. Okay. Obviously that's not going to happen. So just look at what are the days where your schedule really permits that. And just keep in mind the fact that I have had some patients that really want to go above and beyond and do 3 days, and they do find it kind of difficult. So my suggestion is for the better way to fast, if you're going to do this approach, you really start with the traditional 2-day approach. A lot of times my patients will do Monday and Wednesday. Most people don't want to do weekends. That's an obvious one because there's a lot of social engagement. So Monday and Wednesday tends to be good days to do it.
And what about 11:59 the night before? Like, what is your behavior like the night before? Is it going to be harder to fast on a day if maybe you've had alcohol the day before, or if should you have an evening meal, a later evening meal maybe than normal if you're going to be fasting the next day? What do you recommend?
Yeah, so, it's interesting. What I see the biggest difference in how people respond when they're doing a fast in the next day is actually the amount of hours that they're sleeping. That's a really big one. So it's not so much whether or not they have alcohol the night before. I mean, that never helps, obviously. Or if they have like a binge the day before, that's not a good idea because a lot of times you get these drastic shifts in blood sugar and insulin, and then you're more hungry the next day, makes it more difficult. But I would say your sleep patterns are going to be really important because, as you know, Ashley, when you don't get enough sleep, you tend to have much more intensive cravings, tend to be more hungry. So you're setting yourself up in some ways for a little bit of failure, not guaranteed, but you really want to give yourself the best environment. So you want to wake up, you want to have a breakfast that's going to keep you full until dinner. I mean, that's an obvious one, right? You don't want to wake up and have a bagel with jelly, right? For your 200 calories. This is a real area where you need to get bang for your nutritional buck. So really focusing on healthy fats, great sources of protein, things that you know are going to really sustain you, because keep in mind, you do have many hours before dinner. You did mention coffee, Ashley, and so that's a question I get all the time, right? I get people that come to me and they'll say, well, I want to eat better, but I'm not giving up coffee or bacon, right?
Yeah.
And so you can have coffee during fasting days. Coffee does not have any calories as long as you don't add anything to it. And when I say don't add anything to it, I'm also referring to artificial sweeteners, because in some animal studies, we do know that there's this kind of confusion between the gut and the brain, where the brain senses the sweet and says to the pancreas, like, hey, there's some sweet, we got to get this sugar to the cells, and the release of insulin occurs. And so the whole thing with fasting is really kind of stifling insulin, keeping insulin at bay. You don't want to screw anything up during these days to impact that. But coffee in and of itself is a great option, and caffeine can actually help with curbing some hunger as well. So it's an added benefit.
Yeah. Plus, I love the idea of going to bed at like 6:45 p.m. because then you're done with your day. So, I love that part. So one of the things that you mentioned when we were talking about fasting, one of the reasons being a proponent for it is its ability to help with chronic disease. I think it's just really important for me to point out for anyone listening right now, if you actually have a chronic disease right now, if you're diabetic, possibly even if you're pre-diabetic, if you are dealing with heart disease, any of these, if you're going through cancer treatment, Kristin is an incredible expert. Everything she is saying has 100% validity, but it has to be personalized. So both of us would turn around and say, that 500 calorie and that split, and even what you include, it could potentially be effective for a diabetic, but you would really want to make sure that you're being followed and so that you don't have those dips. So just a reminder to everyone, and especially an acknowledgement to our healthcare providers and practitioners watching, we want to make sure we always have that disclaimer to work with someone on that part. So I want to ask a little bit too about on a intermittent fasting day, which is what we're talking about here. We're talking about the idea of like a 5-2 split and a little bit with the differences between men and women. Two things that I want to have you comment on. For women, their hormonal cycle, are there times to not do this or better times to do this? And then also the notion of during your day, like we're big proponents of exercise and working out and activity.
Yeah.
If you're knocking your calories down, should we be knocking our fitness down? So tell me a little bit about those.
Yeah, great question. So usually I do not recommend trying to do one of your fasting days during the time that you're right before your menses, just because of the fact that, again, you can have increased hunger and that type of thing. I think once you do get it, it's fine to fast, but during the time right before, where you might start experiencing really these real heights of hormones and dips and things like that, you don't want to focus on that. In terms of exercise, I always say, and I've seen so many patients that have exercised and they're doing great with exercise, and they come to me and they're like, I'm not losing weight, but I'm exercising so much. Well, they're overestimating really how much they can eat after they exercise. So food, in my opinion, always trumps exercise. And so on fasting days, I actually do tell my patients, don't exercise. That doesn't mean you can't go take a 4-mile walk, but what you don't want to do is get your heart rate up very significantly. Either because of the fact that your blood pressure might be a little bit different on the days that you're fasting, things of that nature. But really, we're talking 2 days out of the week. And if you're sitting watching and saying well, gosh, I always exercise, how can I take 2 days off? Just keep in mind the fact that your calories for those days are going to be significantly down. Yeah. So you're not going to find that your calories are over because you missed a workout. Usually on those 2 days, I recommend walking, but that's the extent of it.
Do you still have people take their supplements in the same space? If you're taking supplements, do you take it at the same, with, as long as it's with a meal, if you normally take them with a meal, or do you have people not take their supplements on fasting days?
No, I definitely have them still continue with their supplemental use. There's no reason not to do that. In fact, if you look at all the different types of fasting that we have, very few would say, well, don't take any supplements whatsoever. I mean, maybe a water fast might suggest that, but I also don't recommend water fasting because some of the dangers of it. So I think no problem if you're taking supplements. The only place where I would maybe guard against a little bit, and this is getting real nitpicky, is looking at multivitamins or certain supplements that are in a gummy form. I think especially if you're doing a 5-2 day, you could of course take those on the other 5 days, but maybe not take them on fasting days. just because you don't want to have huge spikes of sugar, and even though they're supplements, they're still pure sugar. It's not going to be a break. Like, it's not going to break everything. Again, I'm being super nitpicky, but in a perfect world, you would take those on your off days.
Right. Yeah, it's very different than, say, trying to stay in ketosis and what the sugar could do.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's move over to this RTF. So help me understand the other types of fasting and how you could do those better, too.
Yeah. It's called time-restricted eating. Now, most people watching may have seen in the media or articles, whatever the case may be, maybe they've seen it referred to as time-restricted feeding, which is actually not the right term. Feeding refers to like feeding a mouse in a lab.
And hey, Kristin, I'm going to have
so
you...
really talk about it. It's time-restricted eating. Restricted eating is when you essentially will take the hours of day, the hours...
Oh yeah, we were losing you a bit, so I wanted you to start over there. We just were losing you, so if we can just start over on the time release, yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
got it.
Good.
Got it. So with time, and you can hear me now, okay?
Yes, can hear you. Yeah.
Perfect. So with time restricted eating, what you're basically doing is limiting the hours of the day in which you are actually consuming food. So you could do 8 hours a day. You could do 10 hours a day. What's the advantage of time-restricted eating? Well, for many people that are just absolutely terrified of calorie restriction, this is a great option, okay? So when we look at study after study after study, people that are limiting their hours of eating, so let's say you're going to you're going to delay breakfast by 90 minutes to 2 hours, and then you're going to have dinner 90 minutes to 2 hours earlier. Despite the fact that there's no suggestion on really what to eat during that time frame, people still lose weight. We still see improvements in metabolic profile. We just see these huge improvements. And so this is a great option for people that are like, I don't really want to change the way I eat, and I don't want to count calories, because we're not asking them to do that. Now, when we do look at studies, we do see what's called unintended calorie restriction, simply because of the fact that you're just not eating all day long, right? I mean, we eat all day long. Definitely not in line with our circadian rhythm and our circadian clock. We're eating late at night, and we're eating when we're not hungry, etc. So time-restricted eating is really kind of tightening the reins here and giving yourself that 8 to 10 hour time frame. And once that clock hits that time frame, you're done. Like, that's it. This actually is really helpful for a lot of my patients, especially my female patients that are really struggling with late night snacks, because it literally forces them to just not engage in it whatsoever. They just can't, or they're going to be out of the time-restricted mechanism for that one. So time-restricted eating is actually one of my favorite approaches, just because I find it to be an easy option for people to do.
And do you find that there's any difference in, say, if I'm doing 10 to 6 versus 12 to 8, or versus what one of my patients does, 2 to 10? He loves it, and I said, well, is this just a way for you to avoid eating breakfast and be able to eat later in the evening? So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. The studies have not shown, definitely not shown a 2 to 10 approach. It's something that drastic where you can eat later in the day. But, really when you look at it from a mechanism of, again, your circadian clock, number one, you really shouldn't be, 10 o'clock is really late. But let's say you wanted to have dinner at 8 p.m., right? I've actually had moms in my neighborhood that said, I really want to do time-restricted eating, but I have daughters, and I don't want them to see me not eating when they're having dinner at 8:30 p.m. I feel it sends a bad message. So I've actually altered their time period so that they can have dinner with their kids, right? And I get that. So
I love that, actually. I love that.
Yeah. So I still see benefits with that. I think there are still, the fact of the matter is you're still putting your body in probably a 12 to 15 hour fast. I also think, to use your example, Ashley, that we don't have a lot of studies showing this, but we don't see a ton of benefits once you go over that 12 to 13 hour fast. So for people that are doing time restricted eating and they say, well, I'm only going to eat 6 hours a day. We don't really have studies showing the benefits of that, but we have definitely the studies looking at 8 to 10 hours a day.
I love it. So it's so funny. We have a friend of ours, Bob, that popped in. He's like, I just got Invisalign. It's really restricting my eating. And so I was yeah, that's like, it's its own version of time restriction, Bob. So we definitely appreciate that. So when we're talking about this, one of the things I find fascinating about the time restricted, I think if we're checking the boxes, like all the pros, it makes so much sense to say you don't have to count calories. We already covered before, you still have to eat healthfully. But I've seen that people do differently based on how they split up their eating during the time that they are eating. So is that something that you pay attention to or have noticed makes a difference?
Yeah, where I have paid attention to that the most is actually my patients that are athletes, because we will structure their eating plan based on when they need a good amount of fuel for performance. So that would be one place where I would structure it a little bit differently. The example I gave about some of the moms that want to have dinner with their family, that's another area where I would structure it a little differently. And then there's just people that say, well, you know what, this is going to be easy for me because I've never liked to eat breakfast. So I got no problem eating starting at noon. I actually prefer it. And then we have other people that will say, well, I have to eat breakfast. I love breakfast, favorite meal of the day. So, maybe we'll ask them to prolong it by 60 minutes or 90 minutes or something like that, just so that they don't eat the second that their feet hit the ground, right? So I think that's
what about coffee all morning long, no calories? I mean, I worry a little bit about like what that does to your, coffee on an empty stomach, what that does to your, just sort of the acidity, what it might do to your digestion. But it may, I also know there are people that are just like, that's how I do my fast. What have you observed?
Yeah, it really does vary. I know people that could not do a fast without coffee, for sure, because when they feel hunger, that's what they are grabbing. That's what they're turning to. If you really look at serious fasting mechanisms that we'll talk about, usually coffee is contraindicated in those types of things. So you really don't want to have coffee, but as long as it's not going to impact insulin and blood sugar, it's probably fine. Now, I probably, I also, as you know, actually do a lot of nutrigenomics. And so I'm always wary when I hear about coffee, like how many people out there are slow metabolizers that, quite frankly, shouldn't have coffee all day long to curb appetite to begin with. But yeah, I think I see that. I haven't seen it as a hindrance, and I haven't taken it away from my patients that metabolize it fine because it creates a barrier. So if the whole purpose is that diets don't work and, and we know that diets don't work, I'm trying to take away as many barriers as possible for someone to say, well, I can't do this, right? So sometimes coffee can be your best friend during a fast.
So yes, you can. So you gave us a sort of special fasting recipe, the Kristin Kirkpatrick specialty, which is you could be doing this timed fasting, and then you were saying maybe then throw a curveball, and where it's I think you had said like 2 days of intermittent fasting or even fasting mimicking dieting. So tell me first, let's just understand what that curveball is, and that'll allow us an entryway into what fasting mimicking diet is.
Yeah. Absolutely. So one of the things that I think is important, and an important distinction here, is the difference between fasting and what's called a biologic fast. So a biologic fast only occurs once we have completely depleted, for the most part, all sources of energy, right? Then you get into a biologic fast where you really, you don't have anything like that left. Now, that doesn't occur in the 5-2 approach that we talked about or the time-restricted eating, because at some point after 12 or 13 hours, you get nourishment again from some way, right? This is also why fasting is different from starvation. I get that from my patients all the time. Like, I'll say, hey, are you interested in fasting? Oh, I don't think I'd do good on a starvation diet. Could not be more inaccurate to clump fasting and starvation in the same bucket. It's just not. But yes, the fasting mimicking diet is really effective, I think, for people that are doing either intermittent fasting or doing the time-restricted eating approach, because it puts them in that biologic phase. And once they get in that biologic phase, we see benefits above and beyond the weight loss and even just general reductions in chronic disease risk. We actually see in studies, especially in animals, that there is some cellular turnover. There's something called autophagy that happens when you're on a prolonged fasting mimicking diet. So I always say, like, the big bucks in terms of benefits with fasting comes when you go into a much longer fast.
Okay. And longer meaning more days, not longer in terms of duration of time. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep. More days where you're in that biologic fast, right?
Yeah.
Because again, that does not occur with time restricted eating and the 5-2 approach. Those are still awesome approaches. That part of it does not occur.
Yeah. So you sent me one. I've yet to. It's in this nice box at home. The Prolon fasting. But I was joking. I'm like, one of these points, I'll be home. How many days am I supposed to do it for? For 5 days, right? So it's
5 days.
5 days. So tell me a little bit about that, so that maybe I can be more motivated to actually try it out. I know a lot of people have tried it out and are really enjoying the benefits.
Yeah. Yeah. So the fasting mimicking diet, and that's essentially what Prolon is, and that what you were sent. Is a diet where your body is put into a prolonged fast and where your body does not recognize that it's actually getting food of any kind. So your body thinks that it's fasting for 5 days. Now, earlier I told you I don't recommend a water fast, and I don't recommend prolonged fasting with absolutely no food, because there are some major dangers with that. But the fasting mimicking diet was developed by top researchers in fasting at USC, and there's very specific macro and micronutrient divisions that put the body in this fast where the body doesn't think it's having food, yet you as the consumer get to have small amounts of food, so you're not just like grumpy and hangry and all those things that are associated with it. It's definitely a much different experience than time-restricted eating and from intermittent fasting. And full disclosure, I do time-restricted eating, and then every 3 months I do around a fasting mimicking diet, because the benefits are just so incredible. So Ashley, when you get into that, when you get into the box, and you'll see it's very nicely laid out. Here's day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5. Day 1 and 2 seem to be a little bit easier because of the fact that you've got a little bit more calorie. 3 and 4 are a little bit more difficult. And once you get to like day 5, I know I have experienced this, and I know my patients have, you just feel just absolutely amazing. Day 4 is when you really start getting into that autophagy, which is really looking at getting rid of and stifling those inefficient cells and really bringing to the surface the best cells that you have. So there's just incredible longevity impact. And really at the end of the day, when I tell people that come to me to lose weight, I'm going to help you lose weight, but I want you to think larger than this. We need to think of, like, I don't want to be under the ground in 10 years from now. I want to live really long, but not only long, I want to live well.
Live well.
So I think that that's always what we have to look at in terms of anything that we're recommending to our patients. And it's very hard not to look at the longevity impact that we see, especially in some of these animal studies with the fasting mimicking diet, and not consider it.
Yeah. Well, it's so interesting too. I mean, and I love the notion of like every 3 months. So I just think like quarterly. I mean, we're so good about changing our clothes for the seasons. It just seems like, I look at it as a time where people should think about, tuning up your digestive system, doing this. And this can go very much hand in hand with our digestive tune-up that we have at the Better Nutrition Program, because that's a little bit more, that's just adding in some supplements, whether it's glutamine and magnesium, just getting those pieces in. They can be done in concert or, separate from that part. But I love that you were saying it's like, let your best cells show up. It's like that whole notion of, kind of cleansing and coming through that. So it's interesting because there are people who are just massive proponents of a juice cleanse. And I have people saying to me, well, every 3 months or every month, should I do the juice cleanse or should I do the detox, or what about, this other one? Or now do this sort of the fasting mimicking dieting. How do you I have my own perspective, but how do you look at the notion of one or both of those, on that sort of quarterly basis?
Yeah, I mean, juice cleanse isn't going to hurt you, but you're not going to see the benefits. In fact, we don't really have a lot of benefits that we see in juice cleanses, and really what you're looking at is just calorie restriction, right? So that's kind of the important thing. And I think the other really important thing to mention here is that Prolon is the product that provides the fasting mimicking diet, but the fasting mimicking diet is a diet in and of itself. Now, there have been cases where people don't want to do Prolon, and they think, I'm going to figure out, based on reading a book or whatever the case may be, how to do this in my own kitchen. And we've seen some very adverse results from people trying to do it on their own. I think there's even been at least 1 or 2 deaths related to that. So definitely not recommended to do that on your own. But I wouldn't even clump them together, because really at the end of the day, if we're going to take evidence-based approaches, we don't have it with the juice cleanses. We really don't.
Right.
It's just not a lot of research. I mean, I'm sure people feel good after it, and that could just be placebo, or, maybe they just feel great because they didn't have the 3 cheeseburgers that they normally have, right?
Well, and I think the notion of a liquid nutrition. So if you're doing a time release day and you've got your calories are coming from quality liquid nutrition, I think, the reason a lot of people feel better is I think it's just easier, on their digestion. We did have Terry jump in. Terry, thanks so much for joining us. She said she's had success with intermittent fasting, eating from about 11 to 7. She's not overweight, but just wanted to lose about 5 to 7 pounds. And she's really grateful to be learning from you. So thank you, Terry.
Awesome.
Really appreciate you sharing on that part. So I thought we would close with we've heard all this great information. We've talked about how, things to consider, et cetera. So there are people that should just not be fasting. So, I thought that would be a great way for us to just remind, now that we're here, we got everybody excited. If you fall into some of the categories, a couple come to mind for me, but who would you say just definitively not, outside of the fact that you should always talk to your practitioner about what you're doing on that part, but who's the no? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So pregnant women, for sure shouldn't be fasting. Definitely, obviously, type 1 diabetics. Typically, people with a BMI under 18, we don't recommend fasting for that population as well. A lot of times when we see heart failure patients, no fasting involved. We don't want to do that. You hit the nail on the head, Ashley, in the sense that those are ones that don't even look at it. But then we have this whole kind of other world of people hey, you're on blood pressure medication, or you're a type 2 diabetic, but you're not taking insulin. And, so we have all these other areas where it's really important, as you said, to connect with your dietitian, with your physician, just to make sure that it's the right approach for you.
Yeah. I would throw into the mix, I hate that I have to throw it into the mix, but kids and teenagers, these days, this is not something we're recommending on any level. Again, unless you're working with your healthcare practitioner, probably a good rule of thumb is that if you take any medication, even over the counter, is recommended by someone, talk to them about this. So, however, we are doing a lot of great work. You're doing amazing work talking to healthcare practitioners, involving people and sending them stuff so that I can try, actually put my money where my mouth is and say that I've tried this. But what happens when you encounter a practitioner? So let's say that you and I put ourselves in the position of being patients, which we are as well. When we encounter a practitioner that says that fasting thing is junk or is bunk, on that part. I know there's great research. Where would you direct people? You've also, I think, written about, are the posts on your website, or where can people get information that they can sort of go practitioner to share some of the research?
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a healthcare section of the Prolon website called Prolon Pro. And on the Prolon Pro website, and people can also email me or you to get the link as well, all of the research studies that have been done specifically on fasting mimicking diet are listed. A lot of times when I do get that comment at a presentation or someone emails me, it's simply because they just don't know enough about it. And it's really just a source of, okay, here's the educational piece of it, but also keeping in mind that this is not a diet that we're putting on people indefinitely. This is 5 days, 5 days, right? And just as you said, it's not for everyone. The protocol on how many times a year you're going to do it are also different. Based on things like weight and metabolic profile and things of that nature. So even for Terry, for example, who said she's not overweight, but she's been doing fasting and she really likes it. If you're not overweight, typically 3 times a year is recommended. If you are obese, we're going to do it more times a year. But really, it boils down to the research. And practitioners, I know this is true for me. I know it's true for you. We like research. We speak to research. And so there are just a ton of research studies in very, very strong peer-reviewed journals that they can find on that website.
Great. And Terry, I'm going to actually add one more because Terry's point brought up a great piece for that. Is it possible to be on intermittent fasting for a sustained period of time, whereas what we're talking about with the fasting mimicking, you only really want to do that a couple of times a year? Or do you have a time limit? Because I think some people will be so pleased with their weight loss, especially after the fasting mimicking, that they're going to be like, oh gosh, I want to keep this going. So talk a little bit about that part. Yeah.
Yeah, there's absolutely no reason why you should stop doing any kind of intermittent fasting, whether it's a 5-2 approach or a time-restructed eating approach. You should, actually, not just you could, but you should look at this is how I structure my eating for the rest of my life.
Okay, great. So just to clarify that distinction, fasting, mimicking, dieting, probably just a couple of times a year. It's not one of those things that you do it for 5 days and then you do it for another 5 days. But that
Right.
notion, as you were saying with the curveball, it's like then you can go into that intermittent fasting and it'll probably make it feel easier with that experience. Okay. We could talk forever. We will. We'll find a way to grab you and have you come back here. Thank you so much. And again, you guys, this is Kristin. Please visit her website. Sign up for her newsletter. It's one of my favorite ones to get. You can also find her all over social media and just doing different programs. So I highly recommend that part. And Kristin, thank you so much for joining. And I love seeing the picture of the mountains in the background. It just makes me say, like, well, I got to get out to Colorado. So yes,
you got to come out and visit me, Ashley.
Absolutely. Awesome. All right. Thank you.
Thanks.